I'm June Gruber, an associate professor of psychology at the University of Colorado Boulder and director of this mental health expert series. I'm delighted to be here today with Dr. Jutta Joormann, a professor of psychology at Yale University, about her groundbreaking work on depression. So thanks for being with us today, Jutta.
Thank you, June.
I was wondering if you could start by just telling us a little bit about the kind of mental health research and work you do.
Sure. So I'm looking at risk factors for depression and anxiety disorders, which, if you take them together, are some of the, most burdensome and also most frequent mental health issues out there. And even though they're so frequent and often very debilitating, we know little about risk factors still. And the angle that I'm taking on this question is to look at cognitive factors, so things like perception, memory, attention, and how these cognitive factors may increase risk for depression. And I'm particularly interested in how they may help or hinder emotion regulation, which is an important construct that I'm working with. And the question behind that really is, why do some people, even under extreme severe circumstances, with the experience of very stressful life events, not experience something like depression and anxiety, right? So it's sort of a question of resilience, whereas other people seem to, very easily get into cognitive patterns and other problems that may increase their risk for depression and anxiety. So it's really a question of, who's vulnerable and who's not vulnerable. And we think that emotion regulation plays a very important role. So that's the idea that, how you're responding to emotions that you're experiencing is very important. And so if something, stressful happens to you, and you respond with, with strategies that we think are problematic, and in particular, we're looking at rumination here, that may increase your risk of developing something like depression and anxiety.
So how did you first get started doing this work in depression, looking at, because you're saying cognition, emotion, strategies like rumination?
I got really interested in that when I, started out working, actually working with people with depression and anxiety disorders, and sort of realizing how much of what the problem seemed to be about were interpretations of events that had happened and that other people may interpret very differently, but that these interpretations just had this tendency to always go into the negative direction, and that would actually be something, you could sort of see across the board in people with depression and anxiety disorders, and that seemed to be very, that seem to sort of take on a life of their own, and lead into these vicious cycles of negative thinking that would then end in something like depression and anxiety disorder. So it really came out of working with people with depression and anxiety. And I particularly remember one of my first patients being someone very high on rumination, and I just got very fascinated to understand how this cognitive style happens, how people sort of revisit negative events over and over in their mind, and it interferes with everyday functioning, and they get trouble sleeping and concentrating because they can't stop thinking, about what happened and what the consequences of it may be for them. So that really got me fascinated in, looking at cognitive factors and looking at how people are dealing with their emotions.
So I love hearing about the story of how, your career started just having the, as you're saying, in-person human contact, and, thinking about your career since then and now as a professor at Yale University. I was wondering if you could just share a little bit along the way of what have been some notable, frustrations you faced, as well as importantly, successes you've savored and held on to.
Frustrations is probably something that a lot of people, it's not a specific event, but it's sort of the realization when you start out, you're very excited and enthusiastic, and you think you're going to hit on that one thing, right, that you need to understand for understanding the problem, and to just realize as you go along that there are more questions that are opening up than actually answers that you're stumbling on. And that can at times be frustrating. I remember getting very involved in the beginning in genetics work and sort of trying to understand genetic factors and how they may be related to depression and anxiety risk. and sort of, with the naive hope that there may be one factor, right, that may turn out to be really relevant, and then realizing, oh my God, no, it's so complicated. And, and I now see this as a challenge, and sort of a fun challenge, because it also means you never run out of questions. But, there is also the moments where you just get frustrated and you realize, that you've been following a line of work that never really had a chance, because it was just not, really dealing with the complexity of the question the way it should have. So, some hope for people out there who may experience the same thing. And I think a lot of graduate students probably go through this process. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But you also asked about successes. I should talk about that too. Again, I feel like seeing how some of the work that we're doing in the lab actually, gets perceived and actually may help people understand the problems that they're dealing with in the real world. So we currently have a blog, for example, in Psychology Today, where we try to translate a lot of the findings that we have in the lab into articles that are easier to digest for people, and to sort of see the experience, the reactions that people have to that, and how they can relate some of our findings to the problems that they're experiencing in their everyday lives. I think that's really wonderful to see, and sort of a success of what we do, I think.
That's a wonderful way to engage in public outreach too, to take your articles and put them in a form that can be, more widely disseminated. That's wonderful.
Yeah, thanks.
I was wondering, in thinking about the future of the field, what do you see as some of the most important next steps?
I mean, I think more of this kind of dissemination work. I think we're making a lot of progress. It may be slower, coming back to the frustrations than you would sometimes hope for when you start out in the field, for example, as a graduate student. But I think there's a lot of important knowledge that we're generating, and we're, really working hard on translating it into effective interventions. But sometimes there's a step missing in getting this out into the general public, and making it be used by the people who should be using it. And it's sort of this tendency of being stuck in the ivory tower of research. And I think that's going to be a big challenge for the field to overcome this. And I think actually things like this hopefully will be helpful in doing that. I think this is one of the biggest challenges, because I feel like we have made a lot of progress on many fronts. And it's not always making its way to the people who would benefit from it.
I mean, so in terms of, as you're saying, kind of engaging in efforts where you're, sharing what you do and sharing what you've learned with the public, what advice would you have for others who may be watching this interview today, who are interested in the field?
So I think that, reaching out to people is a very important first step. If there are people out there who do research in the areas that you're interested in, there's often lots of ways to get involved. If you're an undergrad student, for example, there may be a lab that you can help in, and that you can get some research experience in. Sometimes it can even be helpful to be a participant in a study, to just sort of see how it's done, and what research actually looks like. There's so many ways right now to get in touch with people over Zoom, and see videos that were recorded of talks and things. And I feel like people are also getting better about doing talks that are actually helpful for the general public. So any of these and many more ideas, I think, how we can relate more, to people out there, and also people can reach out to us, I think. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for speaking today. It's always inspiring talking to you, and particularly during these times when, as you're saying, learning about mental health experts and research is more important than ever. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thanks, June.
Thanks, Jutta.